Well, welcome to the Middlesex Moments radio show. I'm Dr. Anna Wasesha, president of Middlesex Community College, and joining me today is Ruggiero and Terry McNulty. They are both faculty members in the English department here, and I think there are others probably, but two strong proponents for poetry. And we're going to be talking about April is Poetry Month and poetry in general. Let me start out by asking if you know how in the world it is that April even became Poetry Month.
I don't.
That's
a good question.
The only thing I can think of is the Eliot line.
April is the cruelest month.
Yeah.
I wonder.
Maybe somebody grabbed that and ran with it, but I don't know.
Somebody's birthday? Somebody's birthday?
Shakespeare, but
yeah.
that, well, I get, yeah.
So maybe that
he gets some
too?
credit for some poetry.
Yeah.
Give a little bit
just
of credit.
Just a little bit,
Yeah. Yeah. Well, how about like the poet laureate? Is there a poet laureate of Connecticut as well as one for the country?
Yeah. Every state has a poet laureate, and then there's a U.S. poet laureate.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
I was listening to public radio the other night, and they were talking about Wallace Stevens. I was going to say, what do we know about the tradition of poetry in Connecticut? But it's got to be really a wonderful one, right?
Yeah.
Starting
no,
with
it is. It's rich.
Folks.
Yeah.
Was William
really
Carlos
rich.
Williams,
It
New
is.
Jersey?
Yeah.
Yeah, so we don't get to count him.
But I mean,
No, we have, yeah.
Hartford was sort of the epicenter of modernism for a few years in the late 20s and the early 30s when Chick Austin was curating at the Wadsworth. With first Picasso show in the States was at the Wadsworth, and Gertrude Stein premiered a play at the Wadsworth, and I think Stevens was even at that.
Wow.
I don't know if he was the biggest fan of it, but
Yeah.
yeah.
And he worked for an insurance company, right?
Yeah, he
Yeah.
worked for the Hartford.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So he led a dual life.
That's right.
Secret life.
That's right.
Yeah.
And there are other, female poets too. I guess I keep
Yeah.
going back to the women's lit, but Sigourney Street is named after Lydia Sigourney, who is a poet in Connecticut. And she was a contemporary of Emily Dickinson's. So yeah, Connecticut is, a very rich state with poets.
Yeah.
Female and male.
Yeah.
And now we're
Marianne
working
Moore too.
on the next
I'm
generation.
not sure.
Yeah.
Who?
Marianne Moore.
Marianne
I thought,
Moore.
too.
That's
Well,
possible.
Well, yeah.
It's
At one
possible.
time, I think.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
We'll have to look it up. Well, we have to take a break. So this is a very brief introduction, but then we get to come back to two long segments where we can really get into poetry. So we'll be back right after this message. Well, welcome back. This is Middlesex Moments radio show. And today we're talking about poetry with Terry McNulty and Ruggiero. And we were, over the break, just talking about the poetry circuit. So how does that work and what is that?
The Connecticut Poetry Circuit started, I think it was in 1964. It was in the 60s.
Wow.
And it's just a way for Connecticut to have published poets come to area colleges, and they're really generous because they do it really on a dime, and then they make the circuit. And so the circuit, once it started, decided to let's have a student poetry contest, do the same thing with students.
Mm-hmm.
So the contest is held every year, and every Connecticut university and college can nominate one student, and works are read by a board, and some students are selected and some aren't, usually about 5 every year, and they go on tour as well, and they're paid to read their works at colleges and universities across the state.
Has Middlesex ever had one of those poets?
Twice.
Twice.
Once in 1974. I think his name was Jerry Maguire. I don't know where I pulled that out because I couldn't even remember the poet laureate's name of Connecticut. But anyway, and a couple of years ago, Hannah Watkins, she won. So we were really excited and publicized that widely.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So do you know what Hannah's doing now?
She's at St. Joseph's University now.
In school?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And studying?
Creative writing therapy.
Oh, wow. Nice.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
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 So there's a future. You can earn some money as a poet.
That's right. Not many people have, but certainly. I think Hannah might be able to.
I think so too.
Mm-hmm. She is a poet.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And she as well as other people on the circuit are able to make really valuable connections with other writers by traveling around with them, and then with faculty members at various institutions. So it's really a wonderful opportunity for the students who win.
So, go
They
ahead.
actually get a piece published in the Connecticut Review, which is the most prestigious publication in Connecticut. And then they also get to read at Sunken Garden at Hillstead Museum. So they open for instance, this year the keynote is Billy Collins.
Oh, wow.
So they get, it's a lot of networking.
Yeah.
And as Terry said, they have great opportunities and they get to publish.
Mm-hmm.
So that's real cool for them.
Has the online publishing changed how poets think about publishing?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, publishing is always it's a political act, because you have to decide where you're going to send your work and who you want representing your work and how you want your work represented. But I think as a lot of work has moved online, it hasn't only allowed for more sort of formal innovation. So there's a lot more you can do with hypertext, for example, than just what you could do on a page. But it also allows different sort of subgroups within. I mean, it seems crazy to say there's a massive poetry scene, but there really is, even if it's not so visible. All these different subgroups within this very large poetry scene are able to sort of produce the kinds of documents that they feel are the best examples of sort of a vital living 21st century poetry,
So do you read online poetry?
Yeah,
Yeah?
sure.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And do you think people, in the same way that people are self-publishing their own novels, are people being discovered, do you think, in that way? Or
My feeling, this is only anecdotal, is no, not really. I think it's created greater niches for different kinds of poets. We were talking about audience groups for certain types of poets. And I think, one can more easily find a little niche for their kind of writing. So in that way, I think it's good. But I think traditionally, you have to submit, a chapbook or a single poem at a time. And, and it's fine to do it to, online publications. But I don't find that the self-publishing is helping any writers become, discovered, or I haven't. I've actually heard that graduate work can help more than anything. If somebody writes a kid's story or puts together a chapbook through graduate work and then submits it. But I know R.J. Julia Madison, which is pretty well known for having a lot of great authors. They opened up some kind of publishing box. I actually mentioned this to Hannah about going there and seeing what this box is all about. And it's just to help one self-publish.
Oh, so and it actually prints it right there.
It actually prints it right there. And I think there's an illustrator that they can connect you with through their store.
Yeah.
So
yeah, I saw one actually printing books at Politics and Poets and Politics or something like that in Washington, D.C. It was remarkable.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Sounds similar to what I read about going on at R.J. Julia.
Yeah.
I think too that sort of the economy of poetry is different from like the economy of music or the novel or things like that, where we seem to want to discover the next great novel, like socioculturally, or the next great writer even, which I think we tend to think of these days as a novelist. We have whole television shows dedicated to discovering the next great singer, but poetry exists in this other vein of the culture where it's not so obvious and it's not. No one ever really gets discovered. It's more that everybody just sort of talks to each other. I find all kinds of people that I really, really like. And that's sort of, maybe that is the economy of poetry. It's just people who get together, who share a common vision of what the poem is, and you sort of discover each other. But whether we all discover, like, the next whoever, I don't know. I don't know.
Is there a Connecticut kind of pater familias of the poetry world? Somebody who's still around? People are looking to. I'm trying to compare this to my experience in Minnesota, where Robert Bly, for example, was a preeminent. I mean, he was. Yeah. Everybody read Bly.
Yeah.
Because it's interesting to think about it because the last two Barack Obama's two inaugurations, the last two we've had have had poets. Maya Angelou the first time, and tell me the name of the second poet. He had some connection. I see they were blanking. It's terrible.
I'm blanking. I know.
Yeah, right. I just saw a story about him because he moved from Florida to Maine and lives in the woods and writes. It sounds like a great thing to do.
Way to go.
But obviously, it was important. I mean, there's only so much kind of time in an inauguration and to insert poetry, and of course the very famous Robert Frost piece. So why on a national level do we insert poetry into a very important American ritual, but then it otherwise operates in the subterranean world?
Yeah. Well, Billy Collins published a book called something like Poems 180 poems, something like that. And he did it when he was U.S. Poet Laureate in the early, maybe 2002, 2001. And it was a national program to get poetry out to high school students. And his thinking is he kind of criticized the modernists for the fact that the level of difficulty seemed to be the criterion for appraising value.
Yes.
And he said, no, we need to, and plus 9 out of every one poet anthologized is dead. And he's saying, okay, we need to change that. So he had this national program. And the idea is all high schools nationwide, please just read one poem a day, either before school or at the end of the day, to reconnect students with something that they love. Because he said for every non-reader of poetry, they can reconnect through something that they hear. Don't ask them about it. Don't ask them to talk about it in a literary context. Don't ask them to ascribe meaning. Just let them hear it. And sooner or later, reconnect with it. I think that was a great national program.
Yeah.
And I don't know when it died. Do you remember?
I've heard.
That?
Yeah, I
Yeah.
know. I've heard of it. I mean, I think you're really onto something with the idea of sort of the seriousness or the difficulty
Yeah.
with which poetry is sort of affiliated now, or maybe it always has been. I don't know. I mean, poetry has this wonderful quality of being sort of thinky and being meditative and opening weird spaces in your head. And maybe that's why we reserve it for these really solemn occasions. But at the same time, there's all kinds of poems that aren't quite so thinky, or at least not superficially so thinky, that may also open weird spaces in your head. And at the same time, like, maybe we should be opening more time for thought in our day-to-day lives. The poems that I really love dwell somewhere like in this world of being, even if they're very conversational, very approachable. We're so caught up in our day-to-day stuff, like the world where we do stuff, that we don't take a lot of time out for the spaces that poetry can open in your head, these meditative, more being-based spaces.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
I just have to reflect again on someone who, is not ever probably going to rise to being a super great writer, but Garrison Keillor does the Writer's Almanac. You can get it online, so you can read a poem a day, which is wonderful. And then it also, as an almanac, it'll tell you on this day somebody was born or whatever. At least on Minnesota Public Radio, you hear it several times a day. So you're driving around, going on your way to the grocery store, and you get to hear some beautiful, wonderful poem. And it does enrich your life. So I wish Billy Collins' project was hale and hearty and happening in every school.
And there's a difference between listening to a poem and reading it in the space in your head,
Right.
which doesn't sometimes always open the way that it should, because we're too focused on the obtuseness sometimes, how the level of intellectual difficulty rather than sort of a visceral response and kind of hanging on to what we do know about it.
Sadly, we have to go to another break. But when we come back, let's take on this challenge of how do we, here at the community college, how do we try to ignite an interest in poetry? Well, welcome back. We're into our last segment of the program today, and right before the break we were saying let's try to take on in this section how we ignite and reignite an interest in poetry in the students here at the community college. So both of you do this all the time. What have you been doing this year to light it on fire?
Well, I think it starts with the experience of reading the poem. I think sometimes when students first encounter a poem, I'm thinking of like an English 102 class, for example, which is an intro to literature with a composition end to it, that the students often come in worried about poetry, worried about whether they're going to get it or not get it. And when we read it together and we slowly work through each line and unpack potential layers of meaning, the students realize that it's less about getting it than it is forming their own interpretation of it, as long as it's defensible. And I think that's sort of a liberating moment. But I think also exposing students to just all types of poetry and the various kinds of ways that people write and have written can be a really liberating experience, because a student can read Gertrude Stein and say, oh, so you could do it that way? Or they could read a language poet and say, really, so I could just be sort of completely associative and nonlinear and not have a narrative. Yeah, I can work that way too. Or they can read a confessional poetry and say, oh, wow, I can do that. Like, I could tell my own story or reveal something about myself. There's all these avenues that are available, and I think that's one way.
What about you, Christine?
Well, another way is to kind of have this method. So when I do 102, I don't do poetry first, because I think it is the most intimidating of the three genres. So when I'm teaching English 102, I tend to put it right in the middle and build their confidence with fiction, because they can get that. It's linear, most of it, and then go into poetry. And so they have that confidence. And then I think it's exposing them to so many different forms. But I also think it's just hitting them where, pulling at their heartstrings, just like every human being. What connects us? It's when we laugh, when we cry, when we get enraged, when we yell, when we scream, and so poetry can do that. And I think exposing them to that kind of poetry, does wake them up and lets them say, wow, I didn't know a poem could be so powerful.
Right.
And sharing too, it's an intimate experience, it can be. And say, I've had students walk out really upset at the moment because a poem struck them. A student just had lost her husband, and Maria Gillen writes a love letter to her husband. He's suffering from an illness, something like that. And a student says, wow, I didn't realize poetry could really touch me in this way. So I think it's really trying to reach students at different levels. Even just laughing, even just laughter. It doesn't have to be all about death and grief either. I mean, poor Emily Dickinson, she's forever marked as the poet who writes about death. Then you show them another poem that she writes about strawberries, and they grow over the fence, and I could climb if I tried, I know, but if I were a boy, or she says that God would scold because her apron would get stained, for climbing. And then I go, so Emily Dickinson's not so bad. It's not just I heard a fly buzz, right?
Right. Are there some poems that you find that the students are kind of consistently respond positively to?
A lot of the lyrical poems that are personal and that are vulnerable and that show vulnerability and emotion.
And do you think that they study poetry in high school?
I think that maybe they've been exposed to some of the canon, and that's it. It's the strict because I could not stop for death kind of from Emily Dickinson. It's always the same kind of poems, but my sense is not maybe on the scale that I was exposed to poetry or literature in general in high school. I mean, I was reading The Red Badge of Courage. I don't know that they're doing that.
Yeah.
What's your sense?
I think...
Because you came from high school. You taught high school.
Yeah, I did. And I taught some poetry in high school. I remember when I started out, my goal was always to have a Poetry Friday. Because there's all these other goals you got to meet, and there's all the standards you have to meet, and so you're sort of working through all this stuff during the week and trying to hold one day aside just to work on a poem. Because you can really work on critical thinking skills, you can work on writing skills, reading skills, of course, all these things. But in my high school experience as a student, we didn't do a lot of poetry. And I mean, I went to high school in West Hartford, Connecticut. It was how far from Wallace Stevens' home. And I discovered Wallace Stevens when I went to college in Scranton, Pennsylvania. There was some Twain in my high school curriculum, but there was no Stevens. And Stevens is hard. So I get sort of why it wasn't there. But at the same time, I remember this so clearly, when I was a senior in high school, my English teacher had us read To the Lighthouse by Virginia Woolf, and it was over my head. But I remember reading it, and something happened to me while I was reading it, because I was feeling this book was different from other books I had read. And it's not just because it was a challenge, it was because of, now when I look back on it, it's because of the way the language was working. It was because of the way the narrative was structured. And I try to bring that experience of a text that is completely unexpected back to my students. So now, when I'm teaching English 102, I think the poems that I get the biggest rise out of are the poems that are completely what the students don't expect. So if I give them a Bob Grenier poem called A Long Walk, and it's 5 lines long, and it starts out with the word a, the word long, the word walk, and by the 5th line it's morphed into the words walk along, that can be a poem, and that it's doing something really fancy and making an argument about nouns, I think the students are sort of blown away by.
Want to know from both of you how you help students make the transition from being an audience to poetry to taking the step to actually trying to write poetry. So how does that work?
Yeah, it's quite a leap, that's for sure,
Yeah.
for some students. But it's doing. It's the act of just doing and writing. And so a lot of times it'll be on exercises, certain exercises. They'll throw subjects in a hat, and we'll pick one, and mothers. And we'll put it on the board, and that's just doing 6-minute exercises. Because again, it's just the visceral, it's what comes then, and then sharing that. So if it's emotional opinion, I read something once that said Romeo and Juliet had planned on meeting, right? Had planned the meeting. All the romance, all the drama, all the passion would have been lost. And poetry is kind of like a meeting of the heart and the mind, the conscious mind, right? So you're looking for that balance. But first, I think you need the passion, you need the drama, you need it to come out. So we do a lot of 6-minute writing exercises in class, and then we share them. I mean, that's really hard. It could be about abuse. It could be how many jobs a mother's working, or whatever it is. It could be a tender moment, but it's hard to get them to share. But that is really, I think, important.
Mm-hmm.
Losing the idea of anonymity as a writer,
Right.
because you want readers. So sharing and a lot of those exercises, and then we can go back and they can work on craft. We talk about craft and how to then now kind of incorporate the conscious mind into the heart of
So
what they've already done.
What do you mean by craft?
The good old kind of the sound and, getting alliteration or assonance and jammment where the line breaks, and the form, what it should look like aesthetically. Do you want this to be tercets? Do you So then we go back and we talk about those different elements and, what will work.
So right now, or let's say in the last 10 years,
Mm-hmm.
what is the, quote, form or craft of American poetry?
Wow.
It's completely free.
That
It's like we went back in time. Right? I mean, when you say
it's scattered.
Yeah.
I feel like people are coming out of so many different branches into this larger river of whatever the American scene is at the moment. Like Christine and I, for example, we come from very different branches of the same body of American poetry, and God knows there's a lot of other branches beyond that. I could say where I'm at. I'm somewhere between figuring out what on earth was happening in the New York school. So what was Frank O'Hara doing, and what was John Ashbery doing, and what was Amiri Baraka doing, and what was happening in the language poet scene. So Charles Bernstein and Lynn Heginian, Fannie Howe, all that crew, and trying to blend this almost conversational approach with this approach that disassociates meaning and almost precludes meaning. So how do you take this group of people who believed a poem should be a conversation, and this other group of people who refuse to make meaning, and arrive at the synthesis of what comes next?
Yeah. Okay. So yeah, you're working on that.
Yeah.
Yeah. Good. Yeah.
I'll
Yeah.
have that just
Yeah.
by tomorrow. Yeah.
I would say one thing is that rhyme is really, it's not that it's out of the scene entirely, but we've moved away from traditional form. And that's not to say that there's still not a place for it, but the places are really, I think, fewer. So even when you go to look, where should I publish a poem, is really based on free verse and less strict rhyme. But students seem to have the greatest problem letting go of rhyme.
Oh, right.
Oh,
because
yeah.
it's what you've read on birthday cards and things
Right.
like that your whole life.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and so we just have a few minutes left, so I want to ask you both your opinion on memorizing poems. Because I think people do, roses are red, violets are blue. I mean, people have those, and what we often remember has rhyme in it. But so do you ask your students to memorize?
Once in a while I do. Yeah. I mean, for a lit and comp class or for creative writing class, especially if it's their own poem and they love it. I want them to share that with some conviction, especially during a reading. But I would never expect them to, go up for a reading without a piece of paper, because that happened at my wedding and that was a disaster. Shakespeare sonnet. I mean,
Oh, without a piece of paper?
Yes.
Uh-oh.
Yeah, the reader. And I thought, oh, what are you doing? This is, public speaking 101. You don't go up without notes. I do think that it can help, I think, with students making a connection with poetry. But it's not like my standard that you have to do this.
Well,
but I like to incorporate it.
And it kind of evolves out of a narrative, an oral tradition, right?
Yes.
Kind of the Homer's Odyssey and things like that. But I'm always in awe of the idea that anybody could have a whole epic poem in their head.
Yeah.
What do you think about memorization? And then we got to close off this half hour.
I don't spend very much time with my students in memorization, but I kind of think I should, because from my own experiences, it's very valuable to me that I have this. I have a couple of poems in my head, but also chunks of poems that I love so much that just sort of travel with me. I've never really given much thought to why I don't ask them to, other than we spend so much time working through the poems that we never really come to a point of, let's take ownership of that now. Let's lock that down.
Yeah, it is kind of locking it down after you've broken it apart. I'm really sorry to report that, speaking of reporting and brain locking down, that the half hour is over. It happens way too fast. Thanks so much for joining me. I think our advice to the audience would be read poetry, right? and write poetry if you feel like it, and listen to poetry. And be aware that April is Poetry Month. Yay! Even though it is also the cruelest month, thanks to T.S. Eliot. So if you're interested in learning more about Middlesex Community College, we have a website at mxcc.edu. This has been the Middlesex Moments radio show. I've spent a lovely half hour talking with two of our English professors here, Terry McNulty and Christine Ruggiero. I'm Anna Wasesha, president of Middlesex Community College, wishing you a good day.